Morning, everyone. I'm going to give it another minute and we'll kick off the workshop today. Just waiting on see if a few more people join us. Okay, let's kick off. So good morning, everyone. My name is Mairtin Conneely. I'm a solutions engineer with SmartBear. I'm going to be taking you to a workshop today on automating API testing and CI/CD pipelines. So just a couple of slides before we get into the actual the tool itself and the workshop that we're going to go through. So just some information on SmartBear, so some numbers there around the amount of users, customers when we were founded. SmartBear offers a wide range of tools, from UI testing to API testing to API design to monitoring. The tool I'm going to be looking at today will be around the API lifecycle. Okay, the likes of ReadyAPI for testing and automated testing. We have tools like Swagger Hub for your API design and development, which there's a native integration there with ReadyAPI, which we'll look at later. Okay, so you can see there are just kind of wide range of tools that SmartBear provides. So today I'm going to look at the SmartBear API workflow, where we take an API definition, we import it into ReadyAPI, we can build out our functional tests, our performance tests, and our virtualization. Okay, so I will kind of cover some of the ReadyAPI tests and the virtualization today. We can then look at how we can integrate that into our source control management tool, be it GitLab or GitHub or Azure DevOps, which is the environment we're going to work on today. Taking those tests, ReadyAPI tests that we've committed to a repository, we're going to see how we can actually use those as part of our CI/CD pipeline. Okay, there are kind of multiple tools that we can leverage, like Test Engine, Vert Server, and we can talk about them during the workshop today. And then how we can deploy them, your services to like the Docker, etc. Okay, so I think we should just get into the tool straight away. So this is ReadyAPI. Just actually, I should have probably checked. Maybe somebody wants to put in the chat that they actually can see the screen. That everything. Oh, yeah, I can see it. I'm hopefully everybody else can see the screen as well. Yeah. So perfect. Okay. So this is ReadyAPI. It's SmartBear's tool for API testing. So it has a number of modules. Has ReadyAPI tests for functional and security tests, ReadyAPI performance for load testing, and ReadyAPI virtualization for creating virtual services or mock services, maybe for services that aren't always available or that haven't actually, like API services that haven't yet been developed. Okay, ReadyAPI supports a number of protocols: REST, SOAP, Kafka services, JMS, etc. Okay, so how we get started within ReadyAPI is we import a project, or create a project and import a definition. That's usually the process that takes place. Teams will have their API definitions, their whatever protocol they're using, and then let's start to build out functional tests from there. Okay, so if we can create a project, as I just done there, and we can import a definition. Okay, as I mentioned, support for different kind of definition files, WSDL, WADL, Swagger definitions, GraphQL schemas, and async APIs. Okay, you can take it as a flat file from your PC, or in this instance, I'm going to actually take it from a Swagger Hub account. Okay, so that has that native integration there. So if you design your APIs in the likes of Swagger Hub, you can actually import them directly into ReadyAPI. Okay, so we'll pick our sample banking app. And now you can see that we have our API imported into ReadyAPI. Okay, I'm going to save the project. In terms of the project itself, there are two ways. You can save it as a single XML file. Okay, so that would be just one file that teams can work with. But often with the single file, and this is true for any kind of development, you may run into problems when you're just working on one file and if you have multiple people working on one file. Okay, so what ReadyAPI offers is integration with different Git repositories. Okay, so you can take a quick look at what's available. So we have the likes of GitHub integration, Git standard Git accounts like you might have in Azure DevOps, Bitbucket, GitLab, etc. And we'll come to that, have a sample project. So we'll just go through the flow of creating our functional tests and our virtual services, and then we can have a look at a sample project that leverages the Git integration. When you leverage the Git integration, what happens is it takes the single XML file, project file, and creates a composite project. And what that does is breaks down the project into multiple files, so it makes it easier for teams to collaborate on those project files. So we can see our API definition, and we can do some kind of very kind of basic smoke testing on it. We have a vert server. We have a kind of live backend that we can test against. But let's say, for example, we want to create a very simple test case with 2 test steps. Okay, we can right click and create the Git, and we can start to build up our test cases. So with some tools, you may require a bit of scripting to actually build up your tests and your assertions. With ReadyAPI, it's quite simple. It's a point and click. You can just start to create these tests quite quickly. Okay, the bottom we have a number of assertions out of the box that we can use. So a status code assertion and an SLA assertion, you can turn them off and on as needed. Okay, so we're going to add our test case. So it'll generate a test suite for us, our test case, and our test step. Okay, so we have one for our accounts, and we're going to one for our transfers. Okay, so we're going to add that to the same test case, the same assertions. Okay, so now we've used ReadyAPI to quickly build out a test case with 2 test steps. Okay, so we can see we have some data here. So if we maybe take this ID, we can execute that. We get some information back. We execute this, and we get some data. So we post it. Okay, so you could run those as a single test case. But what has happened, this one has failed. We can have a look. We have an assertion failure or an SLA failure. We can configure that to be whatever is required. So let's give it here. Now it's past the the test step. So what happened there is we've executed test case. It's failed, and it's aborted the test. Okay, so we can actually turn that off. Okay, so we can execute the test even if there is a failure. And again, we have a failure here, and it's assertion failure because 201 is not in our acceptable list of status codes. So if we look at the raw implementation there, it's created 201 created, but that isn't in our assertions. Okay, so we can add a 201 here. Okay, so now we've built up that test case. But what might happen then is these are all kind of individual test steps. So instead of kind of hard coding these values, we can look at a test step, and instead of kind of having hard-coded values, we can use our get data feature where we can look at the request from a previous step, take the response, and populate it there. So now we're no longer dependent on kind of having hard-coded value for each of the test steps. We're actually chaining these test steps together. Okay, so when we execute this test case again, it'll execute the first test step, get the value, and pass it to the next test step. Okay, so that's how we start to chain test steps together and build up more complex test cases. So with that and the assertions, and this becomes important, with your testing and how you validate your testing. We have kind of building out a number of assertions is, it's quite easy to do in terms of you can actually look at the raw response or the response and start to add assertions based on the actual information you've received back. Okay, so we could look at the content. So we can hard code data. We can, as before, we can use our get data feature. We may run data drive these test cases, which I'll show in a moment. Okay, so you can build up assertions from the actual response itself. You can add them here through the assertions tab. But we also have a smart assertion where you can look across multiple values and not just look at single values to assert. Okay, so you may want to look at the source or the destination and the amount, for example, and you have different conditions you can look across and different values. So it allows you to build up a more complex assertion based on the response data that you're getting back. As well as that, you can do the same with the received metadata. So again, you can see how you can actually build up these complex assertions to validate your requests and your responses. So again, in terms of running these test cases, we can look at kind of manually kind of inputting this data. But let's say we have numerous records that we want to test against. We can use our built-in data sources to actually data drive these test cases. Okay, so we can create data sources, and if we look at our data source step here, and this becomes quite important in the automation side of things, where we want to execute these tests in an automated pipeline, which we'll come to shortly, and you want to actually data drive those tests in automation. Okay, so you start to build up these complex test cases, and hopefully you see the value of using data driving your test steps. Okay, so we can select Excel, and so on another screen, I'm importing a spreadsheet. Okay, so if we execute this, it's going to give us back a record from our spreadsheet. Okay, we can skip over the header row by just adding 1 to the start row. And now we have some count numbers and some transfer values. Okay, so now we'll also want to loop through those. So we use a data source loop. Okay, so if we select our data source, and our target step is going to be our first test step. So as mentioned, we can now use our data source to data drive the first test step. Okay, I'm going to take the account number. So each time this executes, it's going to populate this with the next account number in the data source. And as previously, we'll take that record and pass it to the next test step. Okay, so you can see there we're executing the test case, and you can see we're getting back. We're inputting now the data that's coming from the data source. Okay, so we know it's the next value. Okay, so that's how we start to data drive though our test cases. So with that and with our assertions, we've quickly taken in an API definition and built out our test case. Okay, but with endpoints, often we won't have access to maybe the endpoint, or it's not available to us. Okay, or it's sometimes down, or for third parties there's a rate limit on these APIs. We could take those 2 test steps that we've just created, and instead of actually hitting the live endpoint or an endpoint that may not be available, we could actually start to virtualize these services. Okay, again, you can go to the same definition, and we can actually add a virtual service. Okay, and the same here, we can add a virtual service. Okay, so now in our virtual service, we have an address, which is our local host. We change it to a different port. We have our GET request and our POST request. Okay, we have a response, which we can populate with some data, similar to what we had in our previous our live endpoint. So we could take that data, we could again data drive it, use a data source to data drive our virtual responses. We could add a second response. Okay, JSON, and that's an OK. And we could add a third response, which might be actually a 400. Okay, and we could just give that a not found. Result. Okay, so now we can look at the incoming request of our on our virtual service. Dependent on maybe the ID that's coming in, we can look at the dispatch style. Okay, so we could return these response in sequence randomly, or use something like scripting or the parameterize option to create different rules. Okay, so we can look at the ID, and if it equals to a specific ID, we can actually return response 1. Okay, and we can set a default response, which could be our not found. Okay, so we can use that, and similar to the transfers, we can build up different responses, okay, for our virtual services. Okay, so that allows us then to take this address to begin with, go back to our test case, and maybe set up a new environment where we're no longer hitting the live endpoint. We're going to look at our local verts. Okay, so this will now be the endpoint we're hitting. Okay, so we run up our virtual services and switch over to our local verts. We can now see on the test case that we're now going to actually execute our test against the virtual service. Okay, so you can see the parameter matches that we set up. There was no match done, so we're getting a 404 error result not found, which means our virtual service. So we can configure our parameters to return, the values you want based on the incoming requests. Okay, you can see that because we only have a sequence in our second test step, our post, that is just returning the 200 each time. Okay, so we start to use virtual services to kind of mock these services that may not be available or that haven't been developed yet. So once we've done that, and we're happy with the virtual services that we've created, we can then deploy onto a tool called Virt Server, and I mentioned that in one of the slides, where we can build out our virtual services and then make them available to the team in your organization. Okay, so let's rename this 20812, today's date. Okay, and we have our Virt Server installed on our network at this address. Okay, so it's a matter of dragging and dropping, and now we see that our Virt Server, our virtual service, has been deployed onto Virt Server. Okay, so we can see it there. Again, it's on the same address. Let me grab this. So now this can become our endpoint if we don't want to test against the local version. Okay, so we can set up a new environment. Okay, we can create. Can set up a new endpoint. Okay. Now in our test cases, once we start up our Virt server, we can execute our tests. And again, we get very similar results. Okay, so we'll get actually from our transaction log, we can see we have a 404 not found, but we can see actually now that we're hitting the Virt server endpoint. Okay, so that's how you kind of take that API definition, as I mentioned, build out your test cases, but then actually start to virtualize those operations so that you can actually build services against those endpoints that may not be available or may have rate limits, etc. Okay. So how does that work with our CI/CD environments? Okay. So we're going to take a sample that I have created here. So as I mentioned, this is a similar project where we're data driving our banking transfers. Okay, where we have a test case, we have some virtual services test steps to start running up our virtual services locally. For example, a data source. In this example, it's a Postgres database. Okay, so as I mentioned, you could use different data sources to data drive your test steps. Okay, we have a post, we have a get, we have a loop. Okay. If we look at our Git integration, as I mentioned previously, we can see that we have the different branches that we can actually commit our changes against. Okay, so when I commit these changes, what will happen is these changes are going to be committed to a repository. And this example is Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps then has a pipeline to monitor if there's a specific change to that branch, and if so, it'll execute a pipeline. Okay, so if we go to our Azure GitHub examples, or Azure DevOps examples, okay, so we can look at our branches. So we have different branches for this example. So here's the one we're looking at. Okay, so we have our tests, our ReadyAPI tests stored within Azure DevOps. Okay, you can see, as I mentioned, because it's Compass project, the projects are split out into different files, and we have our Azure pipeline here. Okay, so if we look at this one, for example, I'm going to show two different examples. One where you can use ReadyAPI's test runner to execute the ReadyAPI tests in the pipeline, and test engine, which allows you to install a test engine on the network and allows you to run multiple projects in parallel, and allows you to queue up different projects or different jobs, ReadyAPI jobs to execute. Okay, so in terms of how we generate the command line for the automated tests, we can select our functional test and we can launch test runner. Okay, so what this does is allows you to kind of specify different environments, different reports you want to generate, and you can generate a command line. Okay, so this will give you a command line to start working with. Okay, you can take that command line and populate it into your pipeline. Okay, so you'll have something like this where we have the test runner, the directory, test results directory, the types of reports that I mentioned. You can overwrite, say, the environment you want to test against. So if you wanted to get your production Vert server, for example, or your different endpoints or your different environments, you can configure this all in using the CLI. So in this example, we have a pipeline where we're going to actually start Vert server through our CLI, get a license file from our license manager, execute our ReadyAPI tests, publish our results, and stop our virtual service. Okay, so if we commit our tests, okay, pull in the existing changes, okay, buzzer up successfully, and we're now going to push. Okay, so I've made a change, and now we should see our pipeline is executing. Okay, so we look at our pipeline, we can see our different stages. So in this stage, it's going to install ReadyAPI. It's going to download and install ReadyAPI onto the machine or the agent that you're running. And so we see the first job done. And now you can see it's the command line. You'll start to see these things executing in steps. So, depending on, and this approach where it's specific to Azure DevOps, this will work in any CI/CD environment. You can take the same approach with the likes of Jenkins, GitLab, GitHub Actions. Okay, so as you can see, it's stepping through those different jobs that we've set up here. Okay, where we're getting our virtual service, we're getting our license, we're running our tests, we're going to publish our tests. Okay, so it's going through those test steps. So while this is executing and while it's going through those different jobs, there is Alternative approach is to use take that same project and execute those tests in Test Engine, and this is where we can use Test Engine to scale up the test you run. Okay, so again, using a CLI, we can install Test Engine, and again, Test Engine it looks something like this. Okay, so it sits somewhere you install a network, you have a UI interface, and it'll give you the projects that you've run or the jobs that you've run, the reports and different information about the different jobs. Okay, as I mentioned, what this allows you to do is send jobs to Test Engine. If you have a license for 3 jobs or 5 jobs, it'll execute that amount of jobs, but will queue up any other jobs you have waiting in the wings. Okay, so any other jobs that your pipelines have executed, it will queue those up, and once one job is finished, it will take that job off the queue and execute that. Okay, so that's this example using ReadyAPI Test Runner. It's a really good approach, but if you really want to scale up, you can use something like Test Engine to execute those same projects. So we can see our tests are running, and again, we can actually start to look at the console. All those tests are running. Okay, so we can see test suite says executed and the tests have passed. And it can publish our test results, and then you can use those as needed within Azure DevOps. Okay, so if we look at our dashboard, now here's an example of how you can actually look at the ReadyAPI tests. Once they have passed, once they have failed, and you can then start to actually dig down into the reports. Okay, so this is the currently executing one, but for example, you may be more interested in ones that have failed, and you can start to look at the logs, why tests have failed, and that also applies when you look at the runs as well. In your test plans, it will give you a breakdown of the failures and the past tests. So yeah, so I think we're nearly there with that pipeline completing. So our tests have passed, and again, if there's a deploy step to deploy your API, that will also be something you can configure in your pipeline. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, if we kick off so if we run this with the test engine, we can actually have a look at, now this is just going to execute a single job. But if we can keep an eye on test engine, we'll see the job coming onto the queue and executing. So while that's happening, I'll maybe have a look into the chat to see if there are any questions from anybody. We've covered quite a lot in a short space of time. So if there are any questions, nothing in the chat so far. Okay, so we should see our jobs executing. So one thing I do want to mention that after this session today, on stage 3, I think Frank Kilcummins of SmartBear is going to be doing a talk on 5 things we've learned that we think will shape APIs in the future. Okay, so I'd recommend heading over to stage 3 to listen to Frank's talk. It'd be very interesting. Okay, so we're going through the same process. Okay, so some questions. So how is it locally deployed and tested on CI/CD? On the CI/CD side, so the tests are stored in any repo. So it doesn't have to be Azure DevOps repo. You could store them in a Git repo and pull them from there. And this is running on a self-hosted agent. Okay, so I think Arthur, I hope that questions. These are actually executed on self-hosted agents, and that's how the tests are run. But the likes of Vert Server and Test Engine can be installed anywhere on your network. Okay, as long as your agent can point to them, and that will, these can be, so they have their own address here, for example, and their own UI to work with. Okay, so now you can see actually Test Engine. It's sent to job to Test Engine. It's sitting on a maybe different network, and it's finished it. Okay, so you can see our tests have now run and they've executed. So that's how. Hopefully that answers your question, Arthur. And regarding virtualization, so just to note that our SmartBear booth is open today. If you have any kind of more in-depth questions around virtualization, definitely head over there or contact us at SmartBear, and we can definitely go through kind of more in-depth session around virtualization with you. But if there's any kind of specific question, if there's any specific questions around virtualization that I might be able to answer today, yeah, please put into the chat. So just in terms of Azure DevOps and some of our other tools, or some of the other tools like Jenkins, we do provide plugins. So maybe if writing the likes of YAML isn't something you're maybe comfortable with, or something you're used to doing, but SmartBear and ReadyAPI provide plugins for the likes of Azure DevOps and Jenkins, where you can actually use the UI pipeline creator to actually create those different steps using that UI test step within your pipelines. Okay, so if you use a visual editor for your pipelines, those steps are there. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot in a short space of time. As I mentioned, if there are any other kind of questions, please really feel free to stop by the booth. And maybe contact us at SmartBear. I seen, yeah. So in terms of test coverage, yes. So within, sorry, I just see the question come in from Carol. Yeah. So within ReadyAPI, let me just put this down. So for your test suites or your test cases, you can enable coverage. Okay. So what you can do is actually look at the amount of test cases based on your API definition, the amount of test cases that you've actually built out tests for and the responses. Okay, and you can actually enable coverage, and once you execute your tests, you can see how much of your API has been covered by tests. Okay, so if we actually execute that, so it will fail. Actually, this is probably failing this one, but yeah. So what you will see here is, yeah, you can expand here and look at the amount of either responses and parameters that need to be covered by your test, and this will enable, and you can include this in your reports as well. So if you want to generate test reports to see how much of your code is covered, that's also possible with the different reports. Okay, so you can include project coverage in your reports. So I hope that answers. Again, please look at our support page. We have a lot of documentation around how you can set up useful test coverage or code coverage for your tests. So yeah, please have a look at those support pages, or those documentation pages, I should say, on the best way to get your code coverage or your test coverage done within those ReadyAPI tests. Exactly, yes, Carol. Yeah, the API specs. Yeah, it's against the specification. Yeah, everything within ReadyAPI is based on the specification. So I hope that answers your question. No problem. Yeah, so I hope everybody's found this useful today, how you can actually build up and kind of quickly build up those test cases and use them as part of your CI/CD environment. Okay, within the space of half an hour, we've kind of shown how quickly that can be spun up on the likes of ReadyAPI. Yeah, I mean, if there are Clinton's just put in the message there about Frank's talk at 11:30, or 10:30. I should probably, or 11:30 CET. Yeah. So I guess if there are no other questions today, yeah, I'd like to give you maybe 5 minutes of your day back. Okay, everyone. Yeah, I'll give it 1 more minute. If there are no other questions, yeah, I think we will maybe sign off on the session today. So I'll just give that 1 more minute. Okay, everyone. Thanks a million for joining today. I hope you found it useful. Hope you can, if you're interested in learning more about our tools, please feel free to contact us, and hopefully we'll talk soon.